concluded. Questions without notice. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On Monday, the Prime Minister said he would seek advice over the course of the next day from the AFP Commissioner about allegations involving One Nation. But today in Senate estimates, the Commissioner confirmed that he had not received a request for advice from anyone in the government. Why did the Prime Minister tell the Parliament he was going to seek advice from the Police Commissioner and then do absolutely nothing? Did the Prime Minister intend to mislead the Parliament, or do all the rules change when One Nation's involved?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yes, that's quite a bit of overreach from the honourable member. As I advised the House earlier in the week, the Commissioner, the AFP, is evaluating the matter that I was asked about on Monday, and I confirmed that they're evaluating it, and the honourable member should know well that both by principle and by law, the AFP should be allowed to complete that evaluation independent of any influence from the government. That's the situation. They're getting on with the job. You're trying to muddy the waters.
The member for Calare. The Minister for Justice will cease interjecting. The member for Calare has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on the steps the government has taken and continues to take to keep Australians safe and secure, including in my electorate of Calare?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, as the investigation into the Manchester terrorist attack continues, the picture is becoming clearer as to the methods and motivations of this attack. The UK Home Secretary Amber Rudd has said, and I quote, "Monday's attack was more sophisticated. Some of those we've seen before. It seems likely that the terrorist wasn't doing this on his own." And as honourable members know, there have now been 6 arrests, and the authorities there have taken strong measures in the light of the real risk that there is a network and a broader and wider conspiracy. And I want to say again, we are all united in this House, in this nation, in conveying to the people of Britain our solidarity and our love and our prayers to the people of Manchester, and particularly the victims and the families of those victims, so many of them so young. Now, this morning, Mr Speaker, I spoke with the President of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, to offer our condolences and our resolute support to Indonesia as we condemn the murderous terrorist attack on civilians and police in Jakarta last night. Now, while we mourn, we must learn from these events as we do and sharpen our resolve to defeat the terrorists abroad and at home. Our first priority is to keep Australians safe. The complex outlook in this area continues to see innovation on the part of the terrorists as they change their methods of operation. We need to be as agile, more agile than them. I regularly discuss this with our agencies. In fact, I was discussing it with several of the premiers only today. We have boosted funding for our law enforcement, intelligence and security agencies by $1.5 billion since August 2014. Through the budget, we're investing an additional $321 million to ensure the AFP has the specialist capabilities it needs to address these threats, the single largest funding boost to the AFP's domestic policing capabilities in over a decade. Our agencies have disrupted 12 major plots since September 2014. A number of them, if carried out, would have resulted in mass casualties, and honourable members will be aware of the plot to detonate devices and commit other assaults in the area of Federation Square prior to Christmas. 63 people have been charged as a result of 28 separate counter-terrorism operations, and just on Tuesday, a South Australian woman was charged with membership of a terrorist organisation. This is a very high priority. There is none higher. Our commitment, resolute, is to keep Australians safe. We have the best agencies in the world doing that job 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We will not rest in our determination to keep Australia secure.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Opposition wishes to associate itself with the remarks of the government. Along with the evil in Manchester, the events in Jakarta overnight are despicable. The death of 3 Indonesian policemen, the wounding of 5 civilians and another 5 Indonesian policemen at the bus terminal, absolutely despicable. At the start of the great festival of Ramadan, showing that terrorists have no respect for faith or creed or the background of any of their victims, and we most wholeheartedly endorse the Prime Minister's remarks.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. I have a document from the Prime Minister's own office which states that the government's school policy is a $22 billion cut compared to Labor's policy. Does the Prime Minister deny that his own office knew it was a $22 billion cut, wrote that it was a $22 billion cut, told journalists it was a $22 billion cut? When will the Prime Minister finally say aloud and stop misleading the Australian people that his school's policy is a $22 billion cut?
Members on both sides, the Leader of the House, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, what we've heard from this captain of fantasy is yet another claim to billions of dollars that he never, ever had. Fantasy money. No, what could be less fair than promising resources that you cannot pay for, promising the NDIS but not being prepared to pay for it? What could be less fair than promising a needs-based school funding system and delivering or threatening to deliver exactly the reverse? Promising fairness and transparency and delivering 27 separate deals. Fairness is not the long suit of the Leader of the Opposition. Neither is consistency, neither is any commitment to equity. And Mr Speaker, when we talk about fairness, what could be less fair than the 14 minutes of torture the Leader of the Opposition delivered to his own caucus today? Mr Speaker, and a cross between Fidel Castro and Kevin Rudd. He went on and on and on for 14 minutes of torture to his unfortunate crew. It only came to an end when it was interrupted by repeated snores and the dull thud of members of the Labor Party falling asleep and out of their chairs. Mr Speaker, he can go on. He can go on about fairness. He has failed to deliver a policy of any consistency, of any equity. Right across the board, Labor has abandoned all of the things they said they'd stand for. They've abandoned needs-based funding completely.
Member for Greenway
They've abandoned funding the NDIS. They talk about jobs and they want to jack up the tax in small and medium businesses. They talk, Mr Speaker, they talk about their commitment to employment and opportunities, and at every turn they want to crush business with higher taxes and fewer incentives. Mr Speaker, our commitment is to deliver fairness with the NDIS. We've made the promise, and we have all made the promise. It was a bipartisan commitment. So now let's pay for it. We've said that there should be needs-based funding. Let's deliver it clearly, transparently. And Labor ran around for years claiming that they were delivering a Gonski model. They weren't. It was a corruption of Gonski, as Ken Boston said. We're delivering it. Our budget is fair, transparent and consistent. Labor has failed. This desperate Leader of the Opposition can bore his caucus as long as he likes, or as long as they'll endure him, but he will not persuade the Australian people he's anything other than a fraud.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member couldn't quite see with the Leader of the Opposition standing, but just before I recognise him, the level of interjections again is ridiculously high. Members will be ejected. The member for Chifley won't interject while I'm addressing the House. Might be good if he just stayed still and kept his mouth shut for a bit. The Leader of the Opposition.
I seek leave to table the Prime Minister's document which shows it's a cut of $22 billion to schools over 10 years.
Leave is not granted. The member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is delivering record school funding that is genuinely needs-based? Is the Prime Minister aware
Member for
of
Tangney
any
resume his seat. The member for Goldstein. No, I haven't. I'm not recognising the Prime Minister yet. I haven't been able to hear the member's question. The member for Goldstein will cease interjecting. The member for Morton will repeat his question. And sorry, the members. Mr Morton, the member for Tangney, will repeat his question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is delivering record school funding that is genuinely needs-based? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternatives?
Prime Minister has the call.
Yes. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, 47 primary and secondary schools and more than 27,000 students in the honourable member's electorate of Tangney will benefit from my government's record investment in Australian schools. Now, we've heard the Leader of the Opposition ranting and raving about school funding. He has been exposed as a phony and a fake. He has been exposed as the author of 27 secret deals, the terms of which he is not prepared to disclose. Mr Speaker, our school funding model is transparent, it's needs-based. It means that the same school with the same needs gets the same funding. Isn't that what needs-based funding is about? Oh, the member for Sydney says it's not. Right, OK. So,
the member for Wells will cease interjecting.
The member for Sydney is trying to lead us into her parallel universe, where needs-based funding does not mean schools with the same needs get the same funding. So I wonder, under Labor's parallel universe of fakery and fraud, who gets more money? Well, I guess it's determined on political grounds. That'd have to be it. So it's not a matter of science, it's a matter of political science. It's not a matter of needs, educational needs, it's a matter of political needs. And that is why, Mr Speaker, Ken Boston, as I noted earlier, distinguished, respected educationalist, described Labor's mishmash of failed, unfunded policies as a corruption. His words, not mine, a corruption of Gonski's model. And, Mr Speaker, we know that under Labor's model, a needy student with special needs in one state could get $1,500 less than exactly the same student with the same needs in another state. The inconsistency, the injustice, no fairness. It's not needs-based, unless you use the member for Sydney's dictionary when things mean the opposite of what they ought to mean. This is literally black means white. That is what she's saying. That's what Labor's saying. They had the opportunity to implement a consistent needs-based funding model. We're doing it, and we're spending $18.6 billion additional money over the decade. Where every year we're spending that money at the end of the decade will be $18.6 billion more than it is at the beginning. We're making that commitment to schools, and we're doing it on the basis of need, and we're doing it honestly and transparently.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Solomon.
Public school principals have travelled to be here in Canberra today. So how can the Prime Minister claim his school funding model is sector blind when Morrison Girls' School in Melbourne, with fees for primary school of up to $27,000 per year, gets 7 times the funding increase of Anula Primary School in Darwin? How is that fair to the kids at public schools like Anula Primary?
The member's time has concluded. Members on both sides, the Leader of the House will cease interjecting. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. Before I call the Prime Minister, this level of interjections will not continue. I'll take severe action, and members, if they continue, shouldn't expect to be warned. Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member would be well aware that under the government's school funding policy, and indeed consistently with the practice of federal governments for many years, the federal government is the largest government funder of non-government schools, and of course state and territory governments are the largest funder of the schools that they own and operate. And so the comparison the honourable member makes is completely inapt, totally inapt. The position is that under our model, by 2027, with all of these systems getting different levels of funding at the moment, a system we inherited from the Labor Party, by 2027, government schools, wherever they are in Australia, will receive 20% of the schooling resource standard from the Commonwealth, and they'll receive that whether they're in the Northern Territory or whether they're in Victoria or Tasmania.
Member for Newcastle
and
will leave under 94A.
Will receive 80% of the schooling resource standard, which is adjusted by reference to the SES formula that determines the community's capacity to pay, again consistent with past practice. It is fair, it is transparent. What Labor has got is a mishmash of promises, inconsistent, incoherent, not transparent. Ours is fair, it's needs-based, it involves $18.6 billion more spending during that time. It is a commitment of $18.6 billion over the forward estimates, rising from $17 billion a year now to over $30 billion in 2027. It is a massive increase in funding, and it is needs-based, sector-blind, transparent. And that's the difference, as endorsed, as recommended by David Gonski. The Labor Party sought to canonise David Gonski, but then they corrupted his vision. We're delivering more money, fairly, transparently and needs-based.
The member for Boothby. The member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. The NDIS will support approximately 58,000 of the 489,000 Australians with severe mental illness. That's just 12% of those diagnosed, leaving 88% of Australians diagnosed with severe mental illness without NDIS support. By 1 July 2019, a number of mental health support services will be defunded, including Partners in Recovery and mental health respite carer support. How can $80 million in the budget from 2018-19 for community mental health services adequately support the remaining 88% of Australians with a severe mental illness?
Good question. The Minister for Health and Sport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Mayo, and I hope that in good faith, when the time comes for a vote on the Medicare levy to support full funding of the NDIS, that in this House she will support full funding and not repeat Labor's mistake of shortchanging the NDIS. And I hope that when the time comes in the Senate, that her colleagues will support full funding for the NDIS. In relation, in particular, to psychosocial services, I deeply respect the question. I respectfully, however, have to correct a number of errors. Firstly, there is approximately $4.2 billion being allocated by the government this year and in successive years to mental health. That includes activities under Medicare, under the PBS, through our hospitals and through community mental health. Approximately $700 million a year, or $3.5 billion over 5 years, will go to community mental health services, so a significantly greater figure than the $80 million that's been outlined. That, however, has been supplemented in this budget, as the member noted. And the reason it's been supplemented is in the original design of the NDIS there was a flaw, and that flaw was that some of those who were outside of the NDIS would miss out on psychosocial services, and psychosocial services are, in addition to the clinical services, they are the support for those with severe mental health conditions to be able to go about their day-to-day lives. Now, that gap was real, and it was something which was identified in a meeting with the Prime Minister and myself by people such as Professor Pat McGarry, Ian Hickey, Jackie Crow from the Mental Health Commission and others. In response to the points that they raised, we responded with an additional $80 million, which both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer themselves championed, and I really want to acknowledge and thank them for their work. That $80 million will go directly to providing additional services over and above the current community mental health services, over and above that which will be developed within the NDIS. It's part of a broad $173 million package, which we laid out only 2 weeks ago in the budget for additional mental health services, including youth suicide, mental health research and dealing with suicide hotspots. So fundamentally important things. All of this, though, is predicated on a working, fully funded NDIS. We have addressed the gap outside, which is why it was welcomed by Professor McGarry and Ian Hickey, but we have also addressed the gap inside the NDIS. So I repeat what I said at the beginning of this answer. I hope that the member, along with all of those in her party, will not make Labor's mistake of shortchanging the NDIS. There is a chance for every member of this House to support a fair and equitable national disability insurance scheme. That moment is now.
The member for Mallee.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Environment and Energy, representing the Minister for Education and Training. Will the Minister inform the House how the government's needs-based funding model will provide the greatest funding increase to the most disadvantaged schools, like St Mary's in Robinvale and Jeparrett Primary School, both in the electorate of Mallee? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy, representing the Minister for Education.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mallee for his question. And I know that he strongly supports the Turnbull government's commitment to increasing school funding by $18.6 billion over the next decade, a 75% increase which will see more than 9,000 schools benefit, including the 119 schools in the electorate of Mallee, with 23,000 students, and they'll all be benefiting from the Turnbull government's schools reforms. Now, Mr Speaker, in the electorate of Mallee, the member referred to Jeparrett Primary School. It will see its funding going from under $5,000 per student today to more than $8,000 per student. And the founder of our great party, Sir Robert Gordon Menzies, went to Jeparrett Primary. Sir Robert Gordon Menzies rejected the sectarianism, the class warfare, the faceless men of those opposite, led at the time by Arthur Corwell. And in 1963, Sir Robert Menzies, for the first time, properly funded the Catholic system. So we won't take any lectures from you, Leader of the Opposition. We were the ones who first supported funding for the Catholic system. We won't take any lectures from you, Mr Speaker. Like St Mary's Catholic School in Robinvale, which under the Turnbull government's plan will get an extra $6 million over the coming decade, Mr Speaker. Now I'm asked, am I aware of any alternative approaches? Well, we know that those opposite have 27 secret and special deals. We know that those opposite support different funding for a student who has the same needs in South Australia to the student in Western Australia. And we know that those opposite never provided sufficient funding for their school reforms. But the member for Sydney, who gave up her high-flying shadow foreign affairs role so she could take some domestic portfolio to be closer to the action, she's been gazumped by our school funding model. And the member for Sydney has to go to the 40 public schools in her electorate, like Burke Street Public School, like Crowd Street Public School, like Darlinghurst Public School, and tell them that they will be better off under the Turnbull government's plans. So the member for Sydney is now looking at her phone. She knows that only the coalition will provide more funding for schools in her electorate and across Australia.
The minister's time has concluded. Just before I call the Leader of the Opposition, I've just been informed the former member for Perth, Alana McTiernan, is in the gallery this afternoon. A warm welcome on our behalf. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. The Executive Director of the Catholic Education Commission of Victoria, Mr Stephen Elder, has said about the Prime Minister's schools policy, and I quote, "If this is supposed to be a needs-based funding model, why will some of the most disadvantaged public schools in the country lose money? How is it fair that the Prime Minister's $22 billion cut leaves the neediest students worse off? Or is the Prime Minister also going to accuse Catholic educators of being dishonest in this debate?"
Leader of the Opposition's time has concluded. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The government's schools funding policy is rigorously transparent and needs-based. It has been endorsed as such by David Gonski himself, who wrote the report upon which the Labor Party relied for years as they proceeded to corrupt that clear vision of David Gonski and his panel to have school funding that was needs-based and transparent. That is why it has been so well received across the nation. The Labor Party, the Leader of the Opposition, can't convince his own caucus of the nonsense that he's talking. He can't convince his own shadow cabinet, couldn't even convince the editorial panel of The Age, Mr Speaker. The reality is this. He has been found out. He and the member for Sydney have been found out that we have delivered exactly what Gonski recommended. Now let's be quite clear, Mr Speaker. Transparent, needs-based. Public schools, government schools, get 20% of the schooling resource standard by the end of the period, by 2027, as they're all progressively brought up to that standard. And that schooling resource standard is not discounted or diminished by reference of a school's community's ability to contribute under the SES formula. That does apply to the schooling resource standard for the non-government sector, as it always has, and for that sector the Commonwealth provides, consistent with the past, 80%. But right now, on average, the Commonwealth is funding 17% of the schooling resource standard for the government sector. We're increasing it to 20%, and a bit over 77% for the non-government sector. We're increasing it to 80%. That's the difference. It is transparent, it's clear, it is fair. The facts are there, the methodology is there, it's one for everybody to see. Now, what the Leader of the Opposition delivered was one shonky deal after
Melbourne
another.
Ports will leave
We've
under
delivered
94A.
a straightforward,
The member for Melbourne Ports will leave under 94A.
transparent system. It is fair, it's consistent, it's national, and it is needs-based, as it should be, as Gonski recommended.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Seek to table the press release from Mr Stephen Elder saying the Liberal Party's forgotten Bob Menzies' old primary school with that bad at education.
The Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the House is quite right. The document is already on the public record, and I refer him to my previous rulings. The member for Barker has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House the importance of providing certainty for Australians with disability, as well as their families, their friends, their carers, by fully funding the National Disability Insurance Scheme? And Treasurer, are you aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Burke for his question and his keen interest in supporting the families of those who are living with disabilities and their carers. There is a $55.7 billion funding gap for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, Mr Speaker, and in this budget we announced how we would fill that funding gap by increasing the Medicare levy by 0.5% 2 years from now when the extra bills come in. Now, it was the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard who said, when it came to increasing the Medicare levy, that the fundamental principle of the Medicare levy is we all put in and we all take out. Now, Mr Speaker, that is a principle that every single leader of the Labor Party has respected, both in government and in opposition, since Bob Hawke first introduced the Medicare levy in 1984. Up until now, Mr Speaker, up until now. Now we have a leader of the opposition who has abandoned this principle like he has abandoned so many other principles, Mr Speaker, in this place. And he has abandoned that principle, as we know, why many in his own shadow cabinet think that principle should continue to be honoured. Just the day before the election, the Leader of the Opposition was asked about the French election results, and he said this: "The lesson is that when mainstream right-wing parties work with mainstream left-wing parties to block out the extremists, we do better." That's the takeout of this for Australian politics. Well, it seems that the lesson that the Leader of the Opposition was seeking to convey didn't last a week in his own mind, Mr Speaker, because his budget, in reply, he chose not to reset from the divisive politics he has pursued as the Leader of the Opposition, but to continue to engage, Mr Speaker, in conflict and in wrecking in this parliament and not being a worker in this parliament. The Australian people want this parliament to work together, Mr Speaker, but the Leader of the Opposition wants to continue to be a wrecker. And that is the approach he has adopted after this budget, Mr Speaker. The budget was a reset for the government in that it said, Mr Speaker, we want to work in the middle. We want to work in the middle to guarantee the National Disability Insurance Scheme, to guarantee Medicare, to guarantee funding for schools, to guarantee support for the pharmaceutical benefits scheme and all of these important services, including affordable housing. But the Leader of the Opposition has chosen not to. But perhaps there are others in the opposition who think they are better able to work in the middle with the government and get things done. I know that Australians living with a disability support the measures put forward in this government, and they are very disappointed in the Labor Party that was the initiator of the NDIS, because they're not seeing that Labor Party in this Leader of the Opposition.
The member for Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, this week the member for Gilmore said about the reaction of schools' principals to the government's funding, and I quote, "They have certainty of funding going forward for as far as they know 4 years. There's a guesstimate there for 10, but no government can absolutely commit to that."
It's a gift.
Is the member for Gilmore correct? Isn't the only certainty for schools a $22 billion cut?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question. She knows, as well as we all do, that the Labor Party's commitment to school funding was based on fantasy dollars. They did not even fund years 5 and 6. They didn't even fund 5 and 6 of what they claimed to be the Gonski funding. So hopeless, hapless were they, running around desperately signing cheques they could not honour. About one bouncing cheque after another. That was the Labor Party's approach. We have fully funded our commitments, and Australian schools and Australian parents know exactly the basis on which the funding will be delivered. They know that it is based on the schooling resource standard. They know that that will increase every year by the costs, by the CPI and the wages CPI, with a floor of 3% after the next several years at 3.56%. They know about that. They know that we will fund government schools to 20% of the SRS. They know that non-government schools will be funded as to 80%. The methodology is completely transparent. And in contradiction to the interjection from the member for Sydney, needs-based funding, to be fair, means that people with the same needs get the same funding. Oh, she shakes her head. Mr. Speaker, what is this parallel universe the member for Sydney is inhabiting? I must say it troubles me. Her electorate is next to mine. I'd be concerned if this sort of parallel universe, black means white, thinking got across the electoral boundary. Mr. Speaker, it's plain. It is absolutely plain that a just school funding system means that a school with the same needs gets the same funding per student from one state to another, from one denomination to another, from one system to another. That's fairness. That's
the Prime Minister. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer?
Yes, sir.
The member for Durack has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister update the House on the government's commitment to the National Disability Insurance Scheme and ensuring it is fully funded? Who supports this approach, and are there any alternatives?
The Minister for Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for her question. And as the member knows, the rollout of the NDIS to full operation in 2020 is now well underway, and moving from 30,000 participants to a number of about 460,000 in 2020 is a massive and challenging enterprise. Already, member, as you're aware, 80,000 people have transitioned into and are receiving services. And to give the House some idea of the scale of this enterprise, over the next 2 years there will be required another 60,000 new jobs in disability care. So all those critical services, Mr. Speaker, have to be paid for. The wages of the new disability care workers have to be funded. Labor designed the blueprint for the NDIS, and they should get real credit for that. It's fallen to the coalition to implement it, and that will take a lot of hard work. But what is the inescapable truth is that the responsibility to pay for the scheme falls on this entire parliament. And right now we have the opportunity of agreeing to a 0.5% increase in the Medicare levy. We can fill the funding gap in the NDIS if we just agree that the average income earner, that it is fair for them to pay $1 a day in 2019. That will fund the scheme and give financial security to the scheme and put it beyond doubt. And to give an idea about what you get in return for that $1 a day, using the example of an Australian who would be born with a disability and receive care from birth. So the NDIA have said that someone in Australia born with a disability such as Down syndrome, the estimate is that they would receive care totalling $3.5 million under the NDIS during their lifetime. That means support for an Australian family. It means the opportunity to have a dignified life, either independently or in supported accommodation, when the young Australian becomes an adult. And in the decades to come, thousands of Australian families are going to face situations just like that, and they can be fully insured for that with a $1 a day increase to the average income earner under the levy. And what, Mr. Speaker, indicates that this is a reasonable approach is when economists actually start agreeing with each other. Chris Richardson of Deloitte Access Economics said back in 2013 it was never funded. There was a promise to do something about spending cuts into the future, but unless you actually have the courage to say what they were, so no, it was never funded. I'm all in favour of the Medicare levy to help fill this hole on the NDIS. Saul Estlake has said, I do think it's justified and reasonable. It's appropriate, if this is an insurance scheme, that there's an insurance premium to pay for it. I don't think that the entire additional cost of the NDIS should be funded by the top 15% of taxpayers alone. He said, I don't understand why the Labor Party continues to insist otherwise, and, Mr. Speaker, neither does the coalition.
Question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister agree with the National Catholic Education Commission, which said today the government's own modelling of its schools plan confirms, and I quote,
Hundreds of Catholic schools will be allocated less Commonwealth funding next year. Dozens of schools will be hit with a funding cut of 50% or more next year, and almost 200 schools will be allocated less funding in 2027 than they are this year. These are the department's own figures. Those figures cannot be disputed. They cannot be manipulated.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our new model of school funding, transparent, consistent, national needs-based, adds $18.6 billion of funding over the decade. New total school funding will be, in total, the school funding will be $242.3 billion over the decade, and as honourable members are aware, it will rise from in excess of $17 billion this year to over $30 billion in 2027. The Catholic sector will see an average annual per-student increase of 3.5% over the next decade. 98% of Catholic students will see growth of more than 3.3% a year from 2017 to 2027. That's well above costs and wages growth. Catholic systemic schools, Mr. Speaker, will receive a total of $28.3 billion in Commonwealth recurrent funding over 4 years, 2018 to 21, and a total of $81 billion over the 10 years from 2018 to 2027. The Catholic sector has the highest per-student Commonwealth funding in every state and territory now and into the future. This represents and reflects student needs and the Commonwealth's role as the majority funder of non-government schools. Now, Mr. Speaker, what the Commonwealth's estimator model does is demonstrate the basis upon which the funds are determined by the Commonwealth, and it is designed to ensure that a school with the same needs will get the same amount of Commonwealth funding, whether it is a Catholic systemic school or an independent Christian school or a non-denominational, non-government school. That is what needs-based funding means. Now, as far as the Catholic system is concerned, it is able to reallocate, to determine the funds that it gets as it wishes. So the Commonwealth is not directing that the funds be allocated in the manner set out in the estimator, but it is disclosing, as a matter of honesty and integrity and transparency, the needs-based model which delivers the funds, the calculation of the funds for the total. So the premise in the honourable member's question is utterly mistaken.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House how the government is taking action to fully fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme and guarantee Medicare? Is the minister aware of any threats to these important services that Australians rely on?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Banks. Only last week I was able to join him in his electorate and to visit a number of local practices. We visited the Brigadoon Medical Practice for GPs in Revesby and also the Narwee Family Care Pharmacy. In both of those practices, we were able to talk about the guarantee that the government has given to Medicare, the guarantee for the support for the pharmaceutical benefits scheme through the agreements with the GPs and the AMA, the agreements with Medicines Australia and with the Pharmacy Guild, something which was of profound importance to each of those practices and, of course, to all of those who attend and benefit from their tremendous services to the community. One of the other things that we talked about was the importance of guaranteeing the NDIS. And I have to say, we were delighted by the support on the ground in the electorate of Banks for the government's commitment to fully and finally support the NDIS, something which never occurred under the previous government, because when it was announced in the speech which was referred to previously by others, by the Treasurer in particular, by the then Prime Minister Gillard, she noted that 55% of the NDIS, and that was all, was funded by the levy. what we have done in this budget is to guarantee for the first time full funding for the NDIS. And you know what? It's the right thing to do. We did it because it was the right thing to do. And we actually thought that they would agree with us. It wasn't some political manoeuvre, it wasn't some clever game. It was something where we thought there would be bipartisan support. And yet we know they, in many cases, also agree with us and believe in it. That's why we've seen the leaks reported in the last couple of days. Only today, there in the Australian from Dennis Shanahan, front page, plain talk on polyspeak in ALP. Bill Shorten can't deny there was a split in Labor over his opposition to raise the Medicare levy to fund the NDIS. But he insists the shadow cabinet is on the same page. Really? On the same page, member for Grayndler, member for Ballarat, member for McMahon. I do not think they're on the same page, but maybe they are. But I'd like to know what the book is. Game of Thrones, perhaps? I mean, what is it today? There's a new edition of Game of Thrones out. It's called The War to End All Wars. Just been announced today. Maybe it's War and Peace. Maybe it's Fight Club. In reality, they know that he's done the dirty, not just on them, but on people with disability, on the people he pretends to represent. In the end, if you don't back supporting the NDIS, you don't back it, and you're nothing more.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Labor's plan to retain the budget repair levy and protect low and middle-income earners from a tax increase is a fair and more responsible way to raise more money. Does the Prime Minister object because Labor's fairer and better plan raises $4.5 billion more revenue than his plan, or is it because, under Labor's plan, millionaires will not get a tax cut on the 1st of July?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Speaker. There has never been a less convincing advocate for Australian workers than this Leader of the Opposition. He sold them out again and again, and he sold them out. He sold them out to the big end of town. Yesterday, he's obviously they're listening to the member for Grayndler now, I think, because the member for McMahon's not sort of running the talking points of the big banks in question time today, so they've retreated in disorder now. And now, fresh from the drawing rooms of Toorak, fresh from the boardrooms of Collins Street, fresh from selling out workers, penalty rates, again and again, he comes here and wants to talk about equity and fairness. Mr Speaker, only a few years ago, his Prime Minister Julia Gillard
Member for Whitlam
and
will leave under
the Leader
94A.
of the Opposition himself argued for the essential fairness and equity of increasing the Medicare levy by 50% so that the NDIS would be funded. Now, it wasn't enough to fund it entirely, but he called on our side of the House, the coalition, to support it, and we did. We backed it in. We backed it in because it was fair, and Labor knew it was fair then, and in their hearts they know it's fair now. The member for Grayndler does, the shadow cabinet does, the caucus does. Not even 14 minutes of torture could change their minds. They know that the National Disability Insurance is a great national enterprise to which the Labor Party can claim to own at least half of it, because it was a bipartisan effort. Labor can say it happened under our government. Oh, they can make that claim. We don't deny the history. But what shames the Labor Party today is having made the promise they will not pay for it. They will not pay for it, knowing the justice that we are setting out, the justice of being able to ask every Australian who pays the Medicare levy, with low-income individuals and low-income households, of course, protected by the threshold, as has always been the case. Labor knows this is just, but their leader, trapped in his own political bind of constantly seeking one cynical tactical advantage after another is not going to look into the eyes of the people to whom he's promised so much and say, we will pay for it. Well, Mr Speaker, we will, and the Parliament will, and Labor will be shown up for makers of empty promises, frauds and fakes, betraying the very people they promised to protect.
The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister representing the Minister for Resources in Northern Australia. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the government is driving Australia's economic growth by supporting major mining projects such as Adani's Carmichael coal mine? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any threats to the jobs and economic development this project will deliver to the communities of Capricornia and across Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question, and I know that she is intensely interested in making sure Adani mine gets going, as all Central Queenslanders are, as a member for Flynn is, as a member for Dawson is, as the member for Herbert should be, as the member for Herbert should be, but of course they're not. Now, the reason they should be interested in Adani mine is because of the $34.5 billion that the coal mining sector brings into Australia and the 44,000 workers, predominantly blue-collar workers, who are employed in the mining industry. A group of people that once upon a time the Labor Party used to support. The Labor Party used to support labourers, but they've sort of given up on that. And I refer to the member for Herbert that the unemployment level in Townsville at 11.3% would mean that she should be a large advocate for Adani mine, a large advocate for Adani mine, and she should be driving the Labor Party that used to support labourers to support the Adani mine. And in that quest to get the Adani mine going, she should be submitted by the member for Shorten. The member for Shorten, he should be supporting coal workers. The member for Hunter, he should be supporting coal workers, but they're not. The Labor Party has given up on labourers. In the hot pursuit for vegan burgers up and down Glebe Point Road, they've given up on people at the Fitzroy Hotel at Depot Hill. They've given up on people at the Railway Hotel at Cessnock. They've lost their soul. The Labor Party's lost their soul. For the member for Grainlow, who actually is responsible for building things, they won't let him speak. He's in splendid isolation. Can't say boo. Splendid isolation. The man's lost his tongue. He's talking in sign language. And what happened? What happened to the party that used to be the party of Ben Chifley? Ben Chifley, a railway worker. Where are the Ben Chifleys in the Labor Party these days? Where are the Clyde Camerons in the Labor Party these days? Where are the Mick Youngs in the Labor Party these days? Where are the people in the Labor Party who actually did labour, who actually did manual work? Oh, we hear a lot about the school teachers and a lot about the solicitors, and fair enough, but they've given up on labourers. They've given up on labourers. And where are the people who should be standing up for people in the CFMEU? What about people in the CFMEU? When are you going to start standing up for workers?
Member for Shorten will leave under 94A.
Going to start standing up for workers? When is the member for Shorten going to stand up for workers? When what has happened? So we are fighting for the Adani mine because we believe that men and women deserve a job, even if it is manual work. We believe that they deserve a job. We believe in the prosperity of Central Queensland. We're going to fight for these workers because we know that you are not. You are not. You do not have the ticker. The member for Maribyrnong does not have the ticker as a former leader of the AWU to actually stand up for workers. He's given up on them. He's left them. He's evolved. Policy's been delivered by the member for Sydney, and she's looking after the inner suburbs, but they've forgotten about Central Queensland, and you've forgotten about them as well, but we'll pick them back up.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. Treasurer, there's a $2 billion black hole in the budget from the bank tax. Will the Treasurer advise the House how he intends to fill it? Or is he simply going to add it to the $750 billion of debt that are revealed in the budget papers?
Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Shadow Treasurer can assert all he likes, but it doesn't make it true, Mr Speaker. The estimates for the major bank levy are set out in the budget papers. Now, the Shadow Treasurer has become the major bank's parrot, Mr Speaker. He jumps from shoulder to shoulder, squawking and squawking on every occasion, squawking on cue in this chamber, turning around to them saying, and who's a pretty boy then? That's the Shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker. He has become the big bank's parrot, Mr Speaker, and he puffs himself and plumes himself up on every single occasion, coming to the dispatch box in his big tough voice, Mr Speaker, but the truth is he hasn't even read the budget papers. What we know is that on this side of the House, when we make promises, Mr Speaker, we pay for them. When we say we're going to increase spending in schools by $18.6 billion, the parents of Australia can take that to the bank. When we say we are going to ensure the National Disability Insurance Scheme is fully funded, the parents and the carers and Australians living with disabilities can take that to the bank, because they know on this side of the House, when we make commitments, we fund them and we support them and we follow through. When those opposite were in government, they ran up spending in real terms, growing at 4%, Mr Speaker, 4% every single year. But their revenue growth was less than 1%, Mr Speaker. Now, there's been only 2 governments that have been ensured in the last 50 years that their expenditure growth does not exceed their revenue growth. It's this government and it was the Howard government, Mr Speaker. When they were in office, when that Shadow Treasurer was the Treasurer who used to stand by Treasury forecasts every single day, and now he seeks to impugn those who he used to praise. What a parrot.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Infrastructure and Transport, representing the Minister of Regional Development. Will the Minister update the House on the government's $75 billion infrastructure investment? Is the Minister aware of any threats in regional Australia, including my electorate of Flynn?
The Minister for Infrastructure and Transport.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Flynn for his question. He is a real fighter for jobs in his electorate and right around regional Australia. And we're getting on with the job, of delivering a $75 billion 10-year infrastructure investment program over 10 years. The Turnbull-Joyce government is getting on with the job of delivering the infrastructure that Australians want, delivering a better, safer, stronger regional Australia. And there's a long list of projects in the member for Flynn's own electorate. The member for Flynn has fought for these and he's delivering. He's delivering through the Kincora intersection upgrades, through the duplication of the Capricorn Highway between Emerald and Gracemere, the Blackwater Aquatic Centre, 6 new overtaking lanes on that stretch between Emerald and Gracemere, the Gaynor Disaster Management Centre, $10 million for the Central Queensland University upgrade. The member for Flynn is fighting for his community and delivering jobs in his community. He's a champion for jobs in his community, but he asked the question, were there any threats? Are there any threats to jobs in his electorate? And there is a threat. There is a threat. The threat is Labor. And the Deputy Prime Minister just mentioned a few moments ago the Adani project. Take the Adani project, for example. This is a project that will create 10,000 jobs. 10,000 jobs the community wants. All on this side, we're all on side. The unions want it, but don't hear anything from Labor. But those opposite, Mr Speaker, they're hopelessly compromised when it comes to these issues. And I feel sorry for them. It's sad to watch, Mr Speaker. It's actually sad to watch. This is not the party of Bob Hawke or Ben Chifley or those other old Labor lions. I mean, sure they'll get out there and they'll roar like lions on the picket lines. They're starting to roar like lions now, but when they come in here, they're just little pussycats, aren't they? Just little pussycats. And they come back in here and they take their orders. They take their orders for those inner city lefties and the Greens. They lose their voice and they come back here. Remember when they sold out? Remember when they sold out the timber workers in Tasmania? Well, they're up to it again, Mr Speaker. They're up to it again. They're up to it again. They're doing it in my electorate today. They're selling out timber workers in Hayfield. They're putting possums before people. They know it's true. They know it's true. They know it's true. They campaigned to shut down the coal-fired power stations in my electorate. They wanted Hazelwood to close. They wanted Hazelwood to close. They had a policy called contract for closure. No wonder the blue-collar workers are abandoning them. No wonder blue-collar workers are abandoning them, Mr Speaker. Now we have the coal workers in Queensland. And those coal workers in Queensland, they're seeing Labor's true colours. We're all seeing Labor's true colour, and that colour is green, isn't it? That colour's green. You need those green preferences. You need those green preferences in those inner-city seats. You need those green preferences. Mr Speaker, don't take my word for it. Look at a real old Labor lion in grey and represent. See what he said. That old Labor lion Graham Richardson said this week, and I quote about Adani, "Protecting inner-city seats from attacks by the Greens was the reason Bill Shorten went all wobbly over the Adani mine in far north Queensland." That's a direct quote. Went all wobbly over the Adani mine because of the Greens. They've sold out the blue-collar workers in regional Australia. They've sold out blue-collar workers for those Green votes in the city.
The minister's time has concluded. The member for McMahon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This week the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "The bank levy is designed, its purpose is to raise revenue. We need to bring the budget back into balance and maintain our AAA rating." Given there's a $2 billion black hole in the budget because of the bank tax, why is the Prime Minister placing the AAA rating at further risk with his government's incompetence?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm concerned that this parallel universe virus is creeping across the opposition front bench. The member for Sydney thinks that needs-based funding does not mean that students with the same needs get the same funding. And now the member for McMahon thinks whatever assertions he makes about the budget are right and the Treasury is wrong. The estimates, the forecast is set out in the budget papers, and the revenue that will be raised by the major bank levy will ensure that we bring the budget back into surplus in 2020-21, and it will ensure that it stays there and that we retain our AAA rating, as has been confirmed by all the rating agencies. The member for McMahon couldn't handle these figures. He couldn't deliver. He and his colleague, the member for Swanee, Lilly, member for Lilly, he's moved, he's vanished, Sorry, he's disappeared. He's disappeared. And he's that's right. He's temporarily lost his seat. But the fact is, Labor's team can't manage these figures. We're bringing the budget back into balance, and we're doing so and maintaining that all-important rating.
The member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Not to be mistaken for the member for
I don't know what the confusion is. We go side to side. Okay? We've been doing it for 116 years. Okay? The member for Swan has the call. Member for Swan has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Counting to two can be difficult sometimes. My question is to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister update the House on the government's investment in rail, including the $10 billion national rail program announced in the budget? How will this transformational investment improve livability and productivity in our cities and regions? I'm sure the member for Grainler would love to hear the answer.
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, I do thank the member for Swan for this question. He's a very strong advocate for his electorate and a very strong advocate for rail and public transport. And I've enjoyed visiting with him the Perth to Forestfield Airport project, which of course benefits from $490 million of Turnbull government funding. And of course we've seen very significant funding for rail projects in the 2017 budget. $792 million for additional projects in Perth, including the Thornley to Coburn line and the extension to Yanchep. Victorian Regional Rail, $500 million committed, and of course $30 million committed for a business case for a rail line from Melbourne City to Tullamarine Airport. There's rail from the city to the airport in Sydney. There's rail from the airport to the city in Brisbane. There's rail from the airport to the city under construction in Perth. It's time we had rail from the airport to the city in Melbourne, and the Turnbull government is taking the lead. And this government has a clear and structured approach to rail. We've committed $10 billion to the National Rail Program, and this will support major rail projects around the country. We've got a structured program with urban rail plans being developed, working with the state government so that we have a systematic approach to delivering rail and to supporting city-shaping rail projects. Now, of course, by contrast, we have the approach from Labor. We saw the Shadow Minister in April announcing yet again, reprising the failed announcement of the New South Wales election campaign in 2015, where he said mysteriously that $400 million was apparently going to be sufficient for a rail line to Western Sydney Airport. What did the New South Wales Transport Minister say about that in 2015? She made the point that it was more likely to be $4 billion if you looked at an extrapolation from the most recently completed South West Rail link. It's a reminder, Mr Speaker, of Labor's rank incompetence when it comes to delivering rail in New South Wales. Let's just remember the record. Let's just remember the record. The Parramatta to Chatswood rail link, they promised and they delivered half of it. The Bondi Beach rail line, promised in 1998, delivered zero. The high-speed rail link to Newcastle, promised by Carl Scully, what was delivered? Zero. The Hurstville to Strathfield rail link, what did Labor deliver? Zero. High-speed rail from Sutherland to Wollongong, what did Labor deliver in New South Wales? Zero. The North West rail link, what did Labor deliver? Zero. The South West rail link, what did Labor deliver? Zero. We had Carl Scully promise a CBD New Harbour crossing. What did Labor deliver? Zero. John Watkins in 2008, what did Labor deliver? Zero. David
Members
Campbell,
on
the
my
West
right.
Metro, what did Labor deliver? Zero.
Minister
The
for
Western
Urban
Express,
Infrastructure will
what
resume
did
his
Labor
seat. The minister will resume his seat. Members on my right, the member for Grainler will resume his seat. The minister's time has concluded. Members on my right. The member for Sydney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, how is the government's funding system fair and needs-based when New South Wales public schools lose $846 million over the next 2 years, while the King's School receives a funding increase of $19 million over the decade?
Prime Minister has the call.
More fantasy money. Well, Mr Speaker, New South Wales public schools and public schools around Australia receive increased funding under our policy, as indeed do Catholic schools, as indeed do independent schools. And to bring the matter close to home for the honourable member for Sydney, I can advise her that public schools in her electorate, under our budget proposals, will receive an extra $44 million over the next decade, which of course is not as much as the public schools in the member for Maribyrnong's electorate, the Leader of the Opposition. They'll receive $152 million over the decade in additional funding.
The member for Page.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Small Business. Will the minister update the House how the government's small business tax cuts and instant asset write-off scheme are being welcomed by hard-working small business owners, including those in my electorate of Page? And are there any alternative plans that would threaten the creation of jobs by small business?
The Minister for Small Business.
Bring it on, small business. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Page for his question. There are 18,173 small businesses in the member's electorate, and he is working, as every member in this government is, to back those small businesses each and every day, Mr Speaker. I spent the day with the member for Page just last Tuesday. We visited many local small businesses which are getting back on their feet after rising water in the Wilson River and the Leicester caused devastating flooding in Lismore in the aftermath of Cyclone Debbie. The member for Page is working with his community, especially the Lismore Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the local chamber. They are restarting the heart of small business in Lismore, and I commend the local chamber, local community leaders, the member for Page and his state colleague Thomas George, who know there is a bright future for small business in Lismore. Andrew Gordon, who is the Vice-Chairman of the Lismore Chamber, knows this government supports small business each and every day. He said every business's major consideration is outgoings, and tax is a big part of that. Any concession that allows us to reinvest, to sell more, to purchase new technologies and the like, and even to put someone else on. That's what Andrew says about our tax cuts. He runs a family-owned real estate firm, and he knows what it's like, Mr Speaker, to take a risk and to be responsible for the wages of local employees. And Andrew also knows what a boost the instant asset write-off extension is, the bill I introduced this morning, and what it does to help small business invest in themselves. It's a massive relief to a number of small businesses, especially in the rural community, to help them invest in machinery and the like, which helps with productivity. But the member asked me if there are any alternate plans threatening job creation, and sadly, Mr Speaker, I can inform him that there are. There are plans to increase the taxes on more than 3 million small and medium enterprises. There are plans to put grubby fingers in the till of every small business in the country. There are plans to cut access to the instant asset write-off. But whose plans are these, Mr Speaker? Whose plans? Surely they can't be the member for Graindler, who told Lateline last year that now we support a reduction in tax for small business. Surely it's not from the People's Choice, Mr Speaker, complete with his own beer, who knows our tax cuts pass the pub test. I hear there are plans, Mr Speaker, to name a wine after the opposition leader, Mr Speaker, because, Mr Speaker, that's what the member for Maribyrnong, all he ever does is whine. He whines about lower tax rates. He whines about the instant asset write-off. He whines about the definition of a small business being a $10 million turnover. Mr Speaker, the member for McMahon, he once called tax cuts a Labor thing. The member for Fenner over there, whose academic days were dedicated to calling for tax cuts, and the member for Maribyrnong himself, who stood at this dispatch box once and said he wanted to create jobs. But now they make up the front bench opposite and they've sold small business out. The message for small business is clear. The Liberals and Nationals
Minister's time has concluded. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.